Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about a late World War II icon and innovator that demonstrated the technological and scientific prowess of a slowly crumbling Germany, and that is the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational, produced, and accepted for military service jet-powered fighter. Shortly after the first flight of the Heinkel HE-178, the world's first operational jet-powered aircraft in general, Messerschmitt began initial design work on the Me-262, then under the designation of P-1065. The initial design, intended to be powered by the BMW 3 jet engine that was incredibly early in its development, was pretty different than the Me-262 that would later see service. Intended to be 9.3 meters long and 9.4 meters wide, the initial design was several meters smaller in each direction. Additionally, the engines were intended to be placed more towards the wing roots rather than the middle of the wings. Effectively, I pictured the initial design looking similar to the Bell P-59 Airacobra, just smaller and also German. Most likely, it was intended that it wouldn't take terribly long for the first Me-262 to take to the air, but due to the jet engines taking far longer to develop, and due to how those engines evolved in their development, the Me-262 was both delayed and altered, both in an effort to make engine testing and replacement easier, and because the intended BMW 3 engines were shaping up to be larger than initially expected, the engines were relocated to underwing nacelles around the midpoint of each wing, and with these initial alterations, the length and wingspan would both increase by multiple meters. Now, the full history of the 262 is certainly its own separate video sometime in the future, as its development and wartime usage and legacy, it's extensive. So for right now, I want to focus more on the size of the Me-262. At 10.6 meters long and 12.6 meters wide, the 262 wasn't a terribly large plane really, but it wasn't small either. It was initially intended that it would be smaller than that, but other factors made it so that wouldn't happen. But what if the 262 was smaller, maybe about half the size dimensionally? What would that look like, and how would it work? Well, you don't have to wonder, because Germany effectively made a half-size version of the Me-262, a mini-me version of the 262, if you will, minus Vern Troyer, rest in peace. This is the Messerschmitt Me 328. Its story begins in the early 1940s with a very low priority project for Messerschmitt and the Luftwaffe, under the designation P-1079. This prospective aircraft was intended to be a small, easy-to-produce, high-speed jet-powered aircraft that could serve broadly as a fighter-bomber. To combine the small size, high speed, and jet power, the intended powerhouse would not be a turbine or turbojet, but rather, Messerschmitt would utilize a pulsejet. The pulsejet is effectively a proto-super simplistic kind of jet engine that, as its name implies, gives its thrust in periodic pulses. The way they work is both pretty simple and pretty genius, really. In broad and simple strokes, a pulsejet consists of a chamber with vents on one side, a fuel pipe, and an igniter. With the vents open, air enters the chamber, and fuel is pumped in as well. Then that mixture gets ignited, significantly increasing the pressure in the chamber, which causes the vents to close. This forces the pressure out of the only other opening, which is the exhaust or tailpipe. As the gas exits, it lowers the pressure in the chamber, which allows the vents to reopen and begins the cycle anew. This simple setup is far, far lighter than a jet turbine or turbojet. For example, the Argus AS-14 pulsejet had a dry weight of just 375 pounds, whereas the BMW 3 sat at 1,375 pounds. While these can provide pretty significant propulsion for just a fraction of the overall weight, compared to a turbojet or even a piston engine, pulse jets are far less efficient at converting fuel to thrust. So while it can provide solid jet propulsion for what it is, its inefficiency only really makes it a sort of stopgap or niche option. And one of those niches can be providing thrust and giving greater speed to small, lightweight aircraft. So Messerschmitt began work on what was to be a small, lightweight, inexpensive parasite fighter to be launched from other larger aircraft. This parasite format would allow them to save weight and space and size that would normally be spent on landing gear and extra fuel and the like. Additionally, the parasite fighter format would actually also make it a bit easier to fire up the pulse jet engines, since while it isn't technically required, having flowing air enter that chamber really helps the engine fire up properly. Initial work on P-1079 would begin in mid-1941, and this work was gradual and low priority, as the current war situation didn't really call for a parasite fighter. After roughly 20 different designs were proposed, P-1079-17 would be accepted for further work and receive the official designation of Me-328. Different fighter and bomber variants would be proposed in the 328A and B, respectively, and multiple sub-variants of each variant would be proposed as well. The 328A1 and B1 would measure in at 6.83 meters long and 6.4 meters wide, whereas the A2, the A3, the B2, and the B3 would measure in at 8.63 meters long and 8.5 meters wide. Each different size aircraft would use the Argus AS-14 pulsejet, but the larger size aircraft would utilize more of them. The smaller designs would use 2 pulse jets, and the larger ones would use 3 or 4. The overall layout of the Me-328 generally resembled the Me-262, just a miniature scaled-down version, with a low-set or mid-set wing, horizontal tail surfaces around the middle of the vertical surface, and, at least on some of the 328 designs, engines that were slung under wing around the midpoint of each wing. For full-scale production, it was intended that these aircraft would be largely made of wood, but the prototypes would incorporate more metal in their designs, likely for increased durability for testing purposes. The production models would use wood, largely due to the fact that they would be viewed as disposable or single-use, made of cheap materials using cheaper and less resource-intensive pulse jets, and not having landing gear. The 328s, while it could be landed on some landing skids and reused, was likely to simply just be dumped by the pilot after his mission was complete. And with a construction time of just 4,200 man-hours per aircraft, which was about on par with, if not less than the Bf-109, the Me-328 would be very simple to produce and produce en masse. For the plane's offensive capabilities, the A models would use forward-firing cannons, either two 20mm or two 30mm cannons, and the B models would carry anywhere from around 1,100 pounds up to around 3,000 pounds of explosives, but the normal bomb load would definitely sit more towards the lower end of that range. While the multitude of 328 variants were submitted to the Reich Air Ministry in early 1942, it wouldn't be until early 1943 that work on them would begin in earnest. This is when World War II started turning against Germany, most notably with their failure to take Stalingrad. Germany would gradually be forced on the defensive, and being on the defensive, or on the back foot, or being desperate, it makes planes like the 328 more enticing. Germany would want some kind of superweapon. Germany would want something cheap and easy to pump out in droves, and Germany would want something that could be used to take out enemy bombers and advancing enemy forces. So, in addition to a multitude of other projects, from actual impressive technological feats to complete flights of fancy, Messerschmitt, along with DFS, began airframe production and further wind tunnel testing and research on the 328, done in order to determine the best spot to put the pulsejet engines. Now, the optimal location for the pulsejets wouldn't just consider aerodynamics. In fact, that probably wasn't the biggest concern. Instead, the most important factor in the location of the pulsejets was probably how much those engines vibrated and damaged the frame. Due to the pulsejet's literal pulsating nature, combined with the 328's largely light wooden frame, the total effect of the vibrations could be incredible and incredibly dangerous. There would be ways to mitigate these vibrations, reducing the overall stress on the airframe by tinkering with the placement of the engines, but they needed to actually run some tests to find that most optimal location. Initially, they wanted to put the engines towards and just above the wing roots, with the exhaust reaching to, just past, and under the horizontal tail surfaces. However, this location quickly had to be abandoned after they realized that having the exhaust so close to the tail would be incredibly dangerous. The pulsating, almost drum-like vibrations from the exhaust could transfer over to the tail, which could damage it and even lead to its destruction. To reduce this chance, the engines were eventually moved out to the wings, about 2/3 of the way to the wing tips, before they were then moved slightly more towards the wing roots for improved aerodynamic purposes. Additionally, just inside of the pulsejets on the wings by the wing roots, you can see these tiny little propellers. Obviously, they weren't there for thrust, but they were there so the pilot could do anything, really. The pulsejets wouldn't provide power for the plane's electrical or hydraulic systems, so something else was needed, and that's where those little propellers came in. Them spinning would generate power, and that power would allow the pilot to properly control the plane. These little propellers, known as ram air turbines, actually still exist and are used on military aircraft even today, in case of a complete loss of power on the aircraft, so the plane can be controlled in an emergency. With the relatively simple design of the 328 frame, by mid to late 1943, the V1 model was in the air. It wasn't in the air powered, mind you, but it was in the air, attached to the top of a Dornier Do-217, connected via a rigid frame, much like later Mistel aircraft. The Me-328 took to the air for aerodynamic and gliding tests. Connected to that rigid frame was a bunch of dials and gauges and whatnot that measured the forces acting upon the 328's frame. These tests showed that the 328 had pretty poor aerodynamics, actually, and when the gliding tests began, they confirmed these initial results. Despite the poor aerodynamics, though, the Me-328 was nevertheless considered to be good enough to advance into powered flight trials in early 1944. towed into the air, this time being pulled behind a DO-217, the poor aerodynamics may have actually been the least of their concerns. When the engines were fired up, despite them taking extra time and effort to determine the most optimal engine placement, the pulsating jet engines led to incredibly severe vibration issues that led to multiple failures in the fuselage and tail. Tinkering with the engine location, moving them to and fro on the wing and even back onto the fuselage, and moving the exhaust to be well past the end of the tail, these vibration issues were eventually lessened but never solved. Additionally, early in flight testing, it was determined that the 328 would be next to useless as a fighter and interceptor, due to the fact that the performance of the pulsejet engines fell off a cliff at medium and high altitudes. This led to the 328A variants being outright dropped, and focus would shift over to the 328B bomber variants, along with a new proposed role. Due to the poor altitude performance of the engines, the 328B was now envisioned to be a low-level bomber and ground attacker, using its over 400-mile-an-hour top speed at sea level to strike hard and fast. Additionally, due to the ever-worsening war situation, it was also proposed that the 328 could be used as a quasi-kamikaze, intended for the pilot to bail out before striking their intended target. In this role, it really didn't matter if the engines caused vibration issues, and it didn't really matter if the aerodynamics were poor. The plane was built to be destroyed after all. These bomber or kamikaze aircraft would likely be carried into combat by either a Heinkel HE-177, a Junkers Ju-88 or 388, or a Messerschmitt Me-264. Alternatively, it was also proposed that they could be launched from the ground, either off of a dolly or rail system. But still, due to the vibration issues with the pulsejet engines, the Luftwaffe and Air Ministry weren't exactly thrilled with the project. So Messerschmitt decided to propose a new variant in the 328C, which would be powered by the Junkers UMO-4 jet engine. However, this proposal was not seriously considered, probably at least partially because bigger, more expensive, and more well-made aircraft like the Me-262 were using the UMO-4, and there was no real point in using an expensive and limited availability jet engine on what was basically a disposable piece of junk. Ultimately, due to the continued vibration issues with the pulsejet engines, the Me-328B project would also be outright abandoned. There would be one last attempt to field the 328, though, although it would be a shell of what it was, almost literally actually, because the pulse jets would be removed and they would just be proposed as unpowered manned glide bombs. These ended up actually being accepted and an order was placed, but this order was never fulfilled. Instead, for this general idea of a pulse jet-powered attacker and flying bomb, the even simpler Feisler Fi-103R, a derivative of the V-1 rocket, would be focused on instead. But even then, these two didn't see much success or use. The failure of the 328 and the disappointing performance of the Fi-103R effectively signaled the end of the pulse jet in military combat aircraft. They were still used in the military, though, to be clear, as America basically copied the V-1 and the Fi-103R for testing and research, and several pulse jet-powered target drones were made and used, but it became clear that the pulse jets were incredibly niche. They're incredibly lightweight and have decent enough thrust, but the vibration issues and comparatively low thrust when compared to turbines and turbojets, that makes them incredibly situational, and one of those situations was not a mini-me version of the Me-262. So while the Me-328 didn't work out as a military combat aircraft, with its smaller size, it could probably be punted across the room by Mike Myers. So that's something, I guess. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, really random, but the other day I bought an incense burner, like one of the ones that uses those little incense cones, and it's a backflow incense burner, where the smoke drops instead of rises and does this little waterfall effect. And it makes you realize how much air is moving in an area, even when it seems like the air is completely still. Like, randomly, a little puddle of smoke will just blow away, and I have no idea where that tiny little gust of wind came from. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.